Her name was Evelyn Dormont. No one remembers it now, only the cage. Only the sound it made when the wind passed through its hollow bars, scraping against rusted metal and dried blood. A sound like a whisper that never ended. That sound, the rattle of chains, is how her story begins. It was the spring of 1452 in a town that fancied itself righteous. Evelyn stood in the shadow of a cathedral spire, accused of heresy. A word that, in those years, could mean anything from speaking truth to power to merely speaking at all. The magistrate said she had mocked the relic of St. Eustace. The crowd said she had cursed their crops. In truth, she had refused to bow. And in an age where obedience was survival, defiance was a death sentence. They brought her to the square at dawn. The bells hadn't yet stopped ringing for morning mass, and still the executioners worked. The town gathered, not in hatred, but in curiosity. Mothers with infants, merchants with bread still in their hands, even children climbed barrels to see. The air was damp with the smell of iron and dew, and from somewhere behind the cathedral came that faint metallic rhythm, the rattle of chains as they wheeled it out. The coffin of spikes. It gleamed, though no one had polished it. A human-sized iron sarcophagus hinged at one side, lined with dozens of inward-facing spikes. Not sharp enough to kill instantly, but sharp enough to remind the flesh that it would die slowly. The spikes were measured, engineered, to pierce just deep enough to wound, never to puncture anything vital. It was not a weapon, it was an instrument. To the church, it was correction through suffering. To the people, it was spectacle. And to Evelyn, it was the end of meaning itself. When they locked her inside, the crowd didn't cheer, they inhaled. The air thickened with the scent of wet metal and sweat, the first breath of panic trapped inside iron. The executioner turned a heavy key, and the sound it made, the dull click of finality, echoed down the square. From that moment, the cage was no longer an object. It was a sentence. They hoisted it up on a wooden beam and left her there suspended between heaven and hell. The spikes pressed against her ribs, her shoulders, her thighs. Each movement, each breath, a choice between stillness and agony. Blood traced slow rivers down her skin, not enough to drain her, only enough to remind her she was still alive. Hours turned to days, and the rattle of chains, constant, soft, merciless, became the rhythm of her dying. That's the part people forget. Death in those centuries wasn't only about ending a life. It was about displaying it. The coffin of spikes wasn't invented by sadists for cruelty's sake. It was designed by bureaucrats, by men who call themselves moral, who use pain as proof of order. The more they made the condemned suffer, the more righteous they appeared. Evelyn's body wasn't her own anymore. It was a message. For every merchant who overcharged, for every peasant who questioned the tithe, for every woman who spoke without permission, her agony was a warning written in blood. This is what happens when one voice forgets its place. But even then, she did not beg. Witnesses wrote of how she looked down upon them, her eyes hollow but unbroken, her voice whispering through cracked lips. Some said she prayed, others swore she cursed the entire town in a tongue no one understood. But whatever she said, they remembered the silence after, and how for a moment, even the crowd looked ashamed. That night, the sound of the chains returned, softer this time. A gust of wind rocked the cage. Someone in the square said they saw movement, but when the guards checked, she was still alive. That was the point. The coffin wasn't meant to kill. Not yet. She would linger, bleed, bake in daylight, freeze in night air. And as her strength left her, the town learned something terrible, that cruelty, when repeated daily, becomes a form of ritual. The same faces gathered at sunrise, pretending it was about justice, but secretly feeding on it. Children laughed, vendors sold bread, the priest spoke of divine mercy, and all the while, the rattle of chains filled the air. Not loud, but constant, threading through every conversation, every prayer, every breath of the market. That sound became the town's heartbeat. And when her voice finally stopped, they noticed the silence more than her death. But her story, like every soul turned to warning, didn't vanish. It haunted their sleep, their sermons, their laws. And centuries later, when modern historians uncovered sketches of those spiked coffins in dusty archives, they realized something darker. These devices weren't rare. They were standardized, mass-produced, a system. The coffin of spikes was never about one woman. It was about control, through fear, through spectacle, through the illusion of order maintained by the slow destruction of the human body. And yet in every era, someone like Aveline stands inside a different kind of cage. The names change, the cages evolve, but the rattle of chains, that faint chilling reminder of obedience, never really leaves us. So as you hear her story tonight, remember, this isn't a tale of the past. It's a mirror held up to every system that trades compassion for compliance. This is Crimson Archive, where we exhume the truths history tried to bury. If you have the courage to keep looking into the dark, to face what we were and what we've become, then stay, subscribe, because what comes next will take us even deeper into the mind of those who built the coffin and those who watched. The sound of chains is still echoing, and we haven't yet seen who forged them.
The Coffin of Spikes did not begin with Aveline. It was not born in one town or one courtroom. It was born from an idea, the conviction that pain could be orderly, that suffering could be sanctified. In the archives of the Inquisition, tucked between scrolls of confession and property seizure, there are mechanical drawings, precise, geometric, mathematical, each diagram labeled with Latin terms, instrumentum correctionis, vigilancia perpetua. These were not torture devices in the eyes of their creators, they were architectures of obedience. The men who built them wore robes, not armor. They held quills, not swords, and they justified their craft with scripture. The flesh must be corrected, they wrote, so that the soul might be saved. But what they never said aloud, what no priest dared whisper, was that salvation was never the goal. The Coffin of Spikes was a theater. Every execution a performance. Every drop of blood an act in a play written by power itself. And at the center of that theater stood the cage, swaying gently, chains groaning, the metal humming under the weight of the wind. That sound again, the rattle of chains. It was everywhere, the town's cruel metronome. Even as the victim bled, the sound reminded the spectators who was in control. Let's look closer, clinically. The design was meticulous, an iron framework shaped to the human form, slightly narrower at the chest and hips to restrict movement. Inside, rows of triangular spikes, some blunt, others sharp, spaced just close enough to keep the body from collapsing fully, ensuring the condemned would remain upright. The spikes were intentionally uneven, creating pressure points that pierced soft tissue slowly, avoiding arteries, prolonging sensation without inducing shock. They thought of everything: ventilation holes to prevent suffocation too quickly, chains long enough to sway, so that every gust of wind would shift the body, drive the spikes deeper, keep the nerves awake. And on the fourth day, the crows would come. The church called it divine punishment, but in truth, it was logistics. Public executions drew crowds. Crowds bought bread. Bread funded the clergy. The system fed itself, like a serpent swallowing its own tail. When asked why such devices were necessary, magistrates often said, "Fear maintains peace." But fear is a strange creature. Once unleashed, it always demands more. That's why the coffin spread, from France to the German states, from Hungary to northern Italy. Each town claimed they'd perfected it. Some added hinges to adjust the spikes. Others made theirs smaller, portable, so they could move the condemned from one square to another. The cruelty became standardized, not to punish crime, but to train obedience. Those who were caged were not always murderers or thieves. Often they were women, healers, widows, dissenters. People like Aveline, whose only rebellion was refusing to be silent. The church feared them more than any army because their power was subtle. It wasn't physical strength, it was the audacity to question. Aveline had once been a midwife. She had seen more births than any priest had seen miracles. And when the plague swept through the region, she tended the sick while the clergy locked themselves behind stone. And when the sickness passed, it was she, not they, who was accused of sorcery, because survival without permission was a sin. The trial lasted 2 days. No witnesses spoke for her. Her testimony was recorded, but not her words. Only her confession, written by the same hand that pronounced her guilty. And still the record shows something remarkable. As they read the sentence, she laughed. No one understood why. Maybe she knew the irony that the same men who condemned her would pray for her intercession when their crops failed. Maybe she saw through the pageantry of it all. Or maybe she realized that even as her body would hang, her name, the name they tried to erase, would cling to the memory of those chains forever. But the system didn't care for poetry. The next morning, the cage opened. As her blood began to dry, the magistrate stood below speaking to the crowd. "Let this serve as a reminder," he said, "that rebellion breeds ruin." And yet behind them, a merchant whispered to another, "They say she never cried out." The word spread like smoke, and within hours her silence became more defiant than any scream could have been. Even in death, she disobeyed. The authorities couldn't stand it. For a punishment meant to erase identity, the coffin of spikes often did the opposite. Each victim became a symbol of resistance, of martyrdom, of memory. The very tool designed to suppress humanity accidentally immortalized it. Still, they continued, because systems built on cruelty cannot stop. They only evolve. Soon the church replaced the coffin with the Iron Maiden, a name that sounds like legend but was very real in concept if not design. It was the same idea, polished for propaganda, a device so horrifying that its memory justifies centuries of silence. And behind every story of the Iron Maiden, behind every whisper of spiked coffins and cages, the same sound lingers, the rattle of chains, echoing through time, each link forged from the same logic, obedience through terror. But what of those who built them? The blacksmiths, the engineers, the men who shaped iron into the spear. Most were ordinary craftsmen, paid, fed, praised. They didn't think of themselves as torturers. They were providers. Their children played in the streets beneath the cages they built. This was the quiet horror of it all. Cruelty industrialized, suffering turned routine. When pain becomes policy, no one feels responsible. And maybe that's why the coffin of spikes lasted so long, because it required no hatred, only habit. But beneath that mechanical rhythm, beneath the sermons and laws, there was something else growing. Whispers, hidden acts of mercy. Townsfolk who turned away when the guards weren't watching. Children who threw bits of bread in the air for the dying. Priests who confessed to nightmares, hearing the rattle of chains in their sleep. The system depended on silence, but silence began to crack. Some say it started with Aveline's cage, the night it disappeared. They claimed a storm came, that lightning struck the beam, that the iron coffin fell into the river. But others said it was taken. that someone or something cut the chains before dawn. That's where the story fractures, because when historians looked for records of Aveline's execution, they found everything. The charges, the verdict, the witnesses, everything but one thing: her body. And that missing piece, that vanishing, would go on to haunt the archives, forcing even the Inquisition to ask a question they never dared before. What if the cage didn't just end a life? What if it unleashed something they couldn't contain? The rattle of chains didn't stop. It changed pitch. And what came next would change the course of fear itself.
By the time Aveline's cage vanished, the town of Dormont had changed. Not openly. The markets still opened, the bells still rang, the magistrates still smiled from their pulpits. But beneath the calm, there was rot. The cage had left a hole in the skyline, and the rattle of chains that had once been constant was gone. At first, the silence was comforting. Then, it became unbearable. Witnesses said the wind still moved as though the cage were there. The same hollow whistle over empty air. The same spectral rhythm in the rafters of the cathedral. Mothers began to hurry their children home before dusk, whispering that the condemned woman still walked in the fields at night. The priests condemned such talk as superstition, but even they began locking the church doors earlier than usual. Fear without spectacle, that was something new. The power that had once kept people docile was gone. And in its absence, they began to remember things. The injustice, the smell of burning flesh, the way the spikes had gleamed in the sunlight. Aveline's silence became contagious, not of fear, but of defiance. And that terrified those in power more than any rebellion. In the years that followed, the coffin of spikes was quietly removed from the records. The magistrates destroyed diagrams, burned confessions, and rewrote edicts to describe lesser punishments. Officially, it never existed. The town's new priests claimed that the stories of the iron cage were pagan exaggerations, a blot of hysteria on an otherwise holy age. But something lingered. Merchants spoke of hearing a clink of chains at night as they passed through the square. Guards refused to patrol near the old execution beam. The blacksmith who'd once maintained the coffin disappeared. His forge left cold, his tools scattered as if dropped mid-strike. Then came the drawings. A scholar in Prague, decades later, cataloging medieval instruments of penance, found sketches of a spiked coffin inscribed with a familiar mark, a small circle with 3 lines radiating outward, the mark of the Ormont tribunal. When the scholar compared them to other records, he discovered something chilling. The same device appeared in cities hundreds of miles apart, but all after the same year, 1452, the year Aveline vanished. And each version was slightly different. The hinges heavier, the spikes arranged like a rib cage, and always chains that could be detached, as if the device itself was meant to be moved or hidden or carried away. For years, historians dismissed it as artistic license, but in 1723, a letter surfaced from a traveling friar describing a caged woman of iron displayed in a monastery cellar. He wrote that the monks believed it held the soul of a heretic who could not die, that when the wind blew through the abbey halls, they heard the rattle of chains and prayed for forgiveness they could not name. Of course, the church called it heresy again. The letter was sealed, the friar excommunicated, and the coffin, if it existed, was never found. Yet, the pattern repeated. Every few generations, a rumor, a sighting, a mention of a woman-shaped coffin half-rusted hanging somewhere no one was supposed to look. Always accompanied by silence, followed by disappearance. But the story isn't about ghosts. It's about the memory of cruelty and how it mutates. By the late 1600s, Europe was changing. Science began to challenge faith. Printing presses turned whispers into pamphlets. The people no longer gathered to watch executions, they read about them. Pain became distant, abstract, mechanical again. The authorities adjusted. Public punishment shifted from the spectacle of flesh to the precision of law. Torture devices vanished,
but the logic behind them remained. The state no longer needed iron cages, it built mental ones instead. Prisons, schools, workhouses. Obedience by design, not by blade. The sound of chains was replaced by the scratch of quills on parchment, the rhythm of signatures that sentenced people in silence. And still, the same principle endured. Suffering was control. Avelin's story might have been forgotten entirely, if not for one archivist in the early 1900s. Her name was Marguerite Volin. She was cataloging medieval judicial relics when she stumbled across a single page, half burned, in a bundle mislabeled architectural plans. It was written in Old French, an inventory of confiscated property after the plague. Among items listed, livestock, fields, tools, was one entry that didn't belong. Cofret de fer, apointes, contenendo un corpus, un no reduit. Iron coffer with spikes, containing a body not yet reduced. Bolin became obsessed. She followed the trail across Europe, from Dijon to Nuremberg, from monasteries to archives buried beneath universities. Everywhere she went, she found traces, sketches, fragments, rumors, all pointing to one thing: that the coffin of spikes was not symbolic, it was real, and it had not disappeared. In 1928, she wrote in her notes, "The cage is not merely a device, it is an ideology given shape. Whoever built it, built a world that could not breathe without it." Her research was never published. The following year, her home was found abandoned, paper scattered, windows broken, and the only thing missing, her notes. But one witness, a neighbor, gave a strange account. He said he heard metal scraping in the night, the sound of something being dragged across cobblestone. Chains, faint, rhythmic, like a pendulum swinging in the dark. They found grooves in the street the next morning. No one followed them, because even then, centuries later, no one wanted to see what might still be moving beneath the skin of history. The coffin of spikes had become more than punishment. It was a philosophy that fear keeps order, that pain builds peace, that silence is safer than dissent. Every regime since has borrowed its logic. The methods modernize, the morality doesn't. And if you listen, truly listen, you can still hear it. The rattle of chains, not in town squares anymore, but in detention centers and factories and prisons that call themselves correctional. The same echo reshaped for a new century. Avelin's story was never just medieval. It was the prototype for every system that trades empathy for efficiency, compassion for compliance. But here's the twist, the unpredictable shock. When archaeologists excavated the ruins of Dormont in 1986, they found part of an iron structure buried beneath the churchyard. It was incomplete, half melted, but unmistakable. A human-sized frame, lined with spikes. And welded into its center, bones. Small, fragile, feminine. Yet the iron showed no sign of having been cut or opened. No tool marks, no evidence of assembly. As if the cage had formed around the body, not the other way around. Experts called it corrosion. Historians called it coincidence. But the locals, when they heard the news, said nothing. They simply lowered their heads and whispered, as they always had, about the wind that moved through that valley, and how if you stand there at night, you can still hear the faint, measured sound of iron shifting in the dark, the rattle of chains, and the echo of a question that has never stopped asking itself. How many cages are still standing unseen?
They say time buries everything. Bones, names, guilt. But some things never stay buried. Some things keep whispering long after the world has pretended to move on. And if you stand quietly enough, in any age, you can still hear it, the rattle of chains. It's not the sound of medieval iron anymore. It's subtler now. It's the hum of surveillance cameras, the click of a locked door in a detention cell, the whir of machinery in a factory that never sleeps. The systems have changed shape, but the principle, the cold, perfect symmetry of control,
remains the same. That's the real legacy of the Coffin of Spikes. It wasn't just a device, it was an idea that infected civilization. That punishment should be visible, that suffering, made public, maintains order. That fear must always have a body to feed on. When Evelyn Dermont was locked inside that cage, the spikes tore her flesh, but they also pierced something much deeper in the collective human psyche. The part that learns to equate authority with cruelty. The part that bows before violence even as it despises it. And over centuries, that infection evolved. In the 18th century, it became the guillotine. Humane, efficient, moralized. Crowds still gathered, still cheered, still fed on ritualized death. In the 19th, it was the workhouse. Punishment rebranded as productivity. By the 20th, the spikes had turned to fences, barbed and electrified. Different metal, same message. And in our own century, we've built cages without walls at all. Digital selves, invisible spikes, social systems that shame, isolate, and erase. The slow bleeding hasn't stopped. It's just become silent. That's the genius of control, when the chains no longer need to be heard, only felt. But here's what history never counted on: memory. Evelyn's name survived, not because the church recorded it, but because someone whispered it again and again in defiance. A mother telling her daughter, a historian refusing to redact it, a stranger online today, reading her story and feeling that chill crawl across their spine. That's how truth persists, not through authority, but through attention. So maybe the question isn't how many cages still exist, maybe it's how many of us still help hold them up. Because every time we watch cruelty and call it justice, every time we mistake obedience for morality, every time we stay silent when a body suffers for the sake of order, we hear it again, don't we? That faint, unmistakable sound, the rattle of chains, reminding us what we once built and what we've never fully dismantled. Evelyn's story isn't history, it's prophecy. The cage was never destroyed, it was inherited. It waits for each generation to decide whether it will build it again or finally break it. And maybe that's the real reason the coffin disappeared. Not because someone stole it, but because someone freed it. Because some nameless soul centuries ago heard that sound in the dark and refused to let it continue. Maybe the Coffin of Spikes didn't vanish. Maybe it transformed into conscience. The next time you hear metal groan in the wind, or a lock close, or the dull rhythmic sound of chains tightening around someone else's life, remember Evelyn. Remember the silence she weaponized, the defiance she carved into the memory of iron. Remember that what we call civilization is only ever a few inches of light away from that cage. And if that truth unsettles you, good. That's the beginning of seeing clearly. Because the real horror isn't the past. It's how easily we can recreate it. And until we learn to look at cruelty not as spectacle, but as warning, until we stop mistaking suffering for strength, the rattle of change will never stop. It will echo in the quiet decisions, the bureaucratic signatures, the everyday indifference that keeps people caged. But you're here, still listening, still awake, and that matters. Because if stories like this still disturb you, if they still make you pause before you scroll away, then maybe the future hasn't surrendered yet. This was Crimson Archive, where history bleeds and memory refuses to die. If you haven't already, subscribe. Not for the horror, but for the truth that hides inside it. Because the next story we open might just be the one that shows how the cage was finally broken. Until then, listen closely. The chains are still rattling. And maybe, just maybe, it's time someone answered back.